Good evening all, and welcome. Emergency personnel certainly have a challenging job, as you are about to find out. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by the incredibly talented Black-Eyed Blonde. I've left a link to one of her latest videos here in the description, and you'll also be able to find one at the end of this video. If you enjoy her awesome narrations, I strongly suggest you check out her channel when we're done here. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your sirens and let the darkness take control. I'm a former paramedic who plays EMT on weekends now. I always thought if I were to experience something paranormal at work, it'd be in any one of the number of ambulances I've used, on account of all the souls that have passed through. My partner and I, this night, weren't that lucky. I used to work in a moderately sized city, in central Connecticut, and our company covered surrounding towns and had contracts to cover inter-hospital transfers and things like that, much further away from our 911 coverage area. The city itself has only a couple of 100,000 people, with suburbs and a river valley, and then rural woods beyond. Nothing special. We had to respond to the fringe of our coverage area in another town, in another corner of the state, literally nicknamed the Quiet Corner, because of how low populated and heavily wooded it was. After almost getting there, we wound up being cancelled in by a closer unit en route. It was 4:30 a.m. on a Wednesday, in the autumn of 2010. We were turning around in a notoriously small one-stop light town. The ride back to civilization from where we were was only a 20 to 30 minute trip, but it's a long, straight, two-lane state route with dim streetlights and thick forest on both sides with occasional residences and very few small businesses. We turned off State Route 44 and on a road named Pumpkin Hill Road, which after a few more turns onto the side street was going to drop us further down 44 in the direction that we needed to be going in. Surrounding us was state forest and a couple of dirt roads, a couple of small rivers and a small lake, and not an awful lot of houses. The houses that were there were spaced apart pretty well. I was riding in the passenger seat with my face in the laptop, writing our cancelled tag, mentally preparing to go home after a long night, and my partner asked, "Do you see that?" and began to slow down. Pumpkin Hill was a gravel road that's fairly narrow, and we had jet black forest on both sides of us. Visibility in front of us was clear, but to the sides you couldn't see past the 5 or 6 foot tall hedgerows that lined the road behind the guardrail. The cab was illuminated by the laptop, so I shut it and looked up, squinted a little, and there I saw it only 100 or so feet in front of us. A very large dog. A very large dog that had silvery grey hair, with straight, cropped ears with little tufts atop of them, walking away from us ever so slowly, with a very unusual gait, almost like it was limping. The damn thing had to be 4 to 4.5 feet at the shoulders. My partner slows to a crawl, thinking it's hurt, and maybe it had a collar or tag. We thought surely such a magnificent beast had an owner. As we slowed to a crawl, something happened that I will never unsee or forget. The idle of the ambulance isn't its usual roar. We're just creeping at 5 miles per hour and gaining. I was on the passenger side, and it was on my side of the road. The plan was for my partner to put flashes on and for me to whistle or hoot, and to see if our new friend was acclimated to humans, and if it needed help, or if he was street tough and let to him on his own. We closed the 100-foot gap at around 25 to 30 feet. As we closed our distance, and right at the 10-yard mark or so, my partner and I simultaneously got a sense of dread. I was suddenly very aware of how much crap I was in, and my blood turned cold. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end. My vision narrowed, and my heart started pumping well over 120 beats per minute. This is when the dog stood up. He just stood up, not like a domestic dog or a bear or a domestic cat would. Their movements are kind of awkward when they stand, and they're usually pretty quick to go back down on all fours after a few steps. And we do have black bears here, but it definitely wasn't one of those. It was too big. This creature was meant to stand up, and he did it as fluently as you or I would. My view of this was from behind, and that thing's shoulders would put an NFL defensive end to shame. It was a massive animal. My partner stopped the truck. The beast cocked its head to the side, ever so slightly to the left, revealing a single yellow-green glowing eye shine, then turned to my side of the woods and bolted. It was over as soon as it started. What my partner and I have always called the werewolf, we now estimate to be around 7.5 feet tall. Our ambulance has a little over 13-foot clearance, and the tufts of his ears lined up with about where our emergency lights were on the front of the top of the truck. The top of its head ended about where the windshield ended. Its shoulders were easily twice as wide as a man's, maybe 4.5 to 5 feet. Its back muscles were well developed, and it had a tamper waist, which led down to a bushy 3 or 4 foot long tail, and I kept referring to it as a he because it had enormous testicles, probably the size of basketballs. How it walked around with those things dragging, I have no idea. Its quadriceps, if I had to guess, were the size of a man's waist, anywhere between 30 to 40 inches. Its legs bent backwards like a canine, so I could make out it had an Achilles heel and massive clawed feet. The upper body details were more alarming to take in. The ears were cropped like a Doberman's, and they stood straight up, and the tufts atop them were a few inches tall on their own. When it snapped its head to the side to acknowledge us, it laid its ears flat back on the top of its head. He was all business when he did that. I got a perfect profile view of its face, and it had rigid, straight cheekbones which led away from its face and towards a gigantic muzzle. The socket around its eye looked incredibly human, and the eye itself was probably the size of a racquetball. And it wasn't reflecting light from our scene or headlights. It was definitely glowing yellow or green. The muzzle could have been a foot long, and it had a big old shiny wet dog nose at the end of it. Its mouth was partially open when it turned its head, and then it looked like it swallowed. I only caught a second or two of the long glimpses of its mouth. Its gums were black, and it had a dark purple tongue. Its teeth were bright white, and it had 2 pairs of fangs. They weren't incisors or inside the mouth. It had a pair of fangs that sat at the front and outside of his mouth, at the front bottom of its mouth. With his mouth closed, you could see them as these were teeth designed for puncturing, ripping, and tearing. Off its incredible shoulders were its arms, which were jacked and almost twice as long as its legs. The claws of the werewolf ended around where his knees were, and its claws had to have been at least 5 or 6 inches long. The claws were attached to digits at the end of a hand and did not look anything like a paw. Its forearms were longer than what his humerus would be, and made up the majority of the arm. Above the elbow were the biceps, which, if I had to guess, were somewhere around 40 inches and well defined. Watching it stand so fluently made sense looking back, as obviously it used the power in its legs and did a sort of push-up with its gigantic long arms to spring into the position. The thing that has always bothered me, though, is that little head tilt he did. I got the sense of dread before he stood up, like my mind and body knew something bad was about to happen, but I didn't know what. It was almost telekinetic. I got this feeling from the werewolf like, I know you mean well, move on, and I was never here. Then it vanished. The expression on its face wasn't angry or a scowl. It was more of a look of indifferent annoyance, like it was saying, "Ah man, who the hell are you? I have to deal with this now?" When it rolled to the right, it bent its legs and just leapt straight up and over the hedgerows. Didn't do a run to start, or even squat that much. He just turned and jumped, and when he did, he kept his body elongated. So from a standing position it went to at least 6 or 7 feet in the air, and far enough in back over the bush to not be seen easily anymore. Another 10 to 15 feet easy. After that, my partner punched it, and we drove fairly recklessly to get off the gravel road and back to one with at least streetlights. I would never have asked him to slow down. We both wanted to get out of there, and we fled with a sense of urgency. I've seen many canines stand on their hind legs. I've never seen a hellhound sprint with precision over a guardrail and a brush. That messed with my head a lot that night. After a lot of research, I came upon the legends of the Michigan Dogman and the Beast of Bray Road. The only problem is I live in Connecticut. We're not known for our Bigfoot sightings or wacky cryptozoology stories. The town of Pomfret, Connecticut, which was close by to the town we were in, does have some interesting wolf lore and a park named Wolf Den State Park. The short version of this story is that General Israel Putnam, yes, that General Putnam, the Revolutionary War semi-hero, killed the last wolf in Connecticut in the Wolf Den around 1764 before the conflict. The story, as I recall, is that wolves were in Connecticut and they were hell. They would eat livestock, and the settlers had killed the last of the she-wolf cubs and her mate, so the story goes. She started slaughtering livestock and stalking and attacking people, not to eat, but to kill. One morning she massacred over 70 sheep, and Israel Putnam was tasked with putting her down. So he tracked her to her den and did so. The wolf den is still there to this day. There have been dogman sightings close by in Massachusetts, and even legitimate grey wolf sightings. In the last decade or so, wolves have been finding their way down New England from Canada. I don't really know what to believe, and it's certainly not werewolves, but I totally saw something that really looked like a werewolf just that one time. My partner and I had been working together in that ambulance for 3 years at the time. We knew each other pretty well, and as alarming as the events that transpired in the front of us were, there was something off about Ron for weeks after the sighting. The ride back to operations, we just could not believe what we had just seen, and exchanged things like, "What the hell was that?" and "I don't know, asshole, the same thing you saw." Did we really just see that happen? I can't believe it just happened. After we refueled our truck, we punched out, and the next I saw him was that Thursday night, for our last tour of the week before our 3 days off. When I showed up, he notified me that he had called dispatch and requested to be posted in downtown the entire night, not wanting to leave the confines of the inner city. Not an unusual or odd request, as some people prefer the busier assignments, and we definitely did, but it became a habit with Ron as weeks and months went by, and we were never sent out to suburbia for a call after dark for the rest of our 5 total years together. I thought I was just as shaken up as he was, but something was sitting sideways with me the way he was acting, and every time I approached him to talk about it, he would immediately dismiss the topic and be stoic and quiet, or change the subject entirely, leaving an odd vibe that I'd never felt around my work brother before. Absolutely nothing changed about our job performance or our friendship, but after a while, I suspected that my partner had seen something like this before, or had seen something that I hadn't on the night of the sighting. After years of patiently prodding him and asking him what was wrong, he finally disclosed what was bothering him so much about the sighting, and it turned out it was the latter. 9 years later, I have his permission to relay his point of view. Our ambulance was a 2008 AEV box truck. It had a 13-foot clearance, and Ron is 6'5" and I'm about 5'10". But when seated in the cab, sitting up and facing towards the top, our heads were probably somewhere around 7 to half 8 feet off the deck. As a passenger, you can't see an awful lot of the mirrors, but as the driver, you can see down the side of the truck and pretty well behind you. There was also a mobile data terminal that controlled several functions, including lights, sirens, scene lights, dispatch response, and it also had a 4-screen camera that showed a backup camera which was mounted on top of the back, pointing down at an angle, 2 side cameras which covered the outer ends of the ambulance, and a patient compartment camera, which was the only one that recorded. When you were in the driver's seat, you had pretty much all 360 degrees covered. As a passenger, the most you could see out of the mirrors was Jack, especially since Ron was a giant and we fought over the mirror angles all the time. As relayed to me by him, Ron said that when he completely stopped, he was looking at the werewolf in front of us, but had a pit in his stomach convincing him that he wasn't actually looking at us when it turned its head. My eyes were fixated in front of us on Wolfman number 1. Ron, trusting his instincts, and which I did not notice him doing because I was busy trying not to piss myself, already had the MDT angled right at him and started cycling through the cameras and turned the side and rear scene lights on. The scene lights aren't emergency lights. Scene lights are these bright white blue hued LED lights that are bright so you could probably land a space shuttle from orbit on them. When he did that, he noticed that our friend in front of us was in fact not alone. Ron caught a glimpse of 2 of them behind us, and 1 coming up on the side of the ambulance. The 2 behind us he described as Coyote Tan, on all 4s, standing right in what our blind spot would have been. The way the camera in the back is angled, he said all he could see were the tops of their heads, the tops of their torsos, their arms and shoulders, and their massive paw hands. He described them exactly the way that I described the first one, except with the color variation. When he turned the scene lights on, they bolted to the right side of the road out of the view of the camera. This is where it gets a little creepier. After watching their shadows and movements going towards the right of the tree line and brush, Ron cycled the MDT monitor to the starboard side camera, hoping to catch them and see if they were going to advance towards us or run into the brush. Mind you, this is all happening quickly and within a matter of seconds. When he cycled the camera, what he saw was another dogman, this one on its hind legs and blacker than the blackest black. So massive it was filling the entire monitor, and with its left hand was trying to open the door into the patient compartment area. Ron had hit the scene lights and cycled the camera and lost sight of the other 2 Coyote Tan dogmen. And as he couldn't see too much from the camera view, He looked in the passenger side mirror and said when he did, the black dog man looked right at him with its yellow eyes and grinned at him. He did see the coyote tan dog man leap over the brush behind the grinning one. He told me, "Danny, if you rolled your windows down and reached your arm out, you guys could have shaken hands." When he told me this, almost a decade after the incident, my blood ran cold again. He didn't discuss it for years, and all of this time I have no idea one was less than 5 feet behind my right shoulder. He said that the grinning dog man was a sinister-looking creature. It was clearly trying to stealthily open the patient compartment door on the right of us, and luckily, the locks engaged when the vehicle was in motion. When it was staring at him in the mirror with its toothy grin, it moved its head and saw the dog man we initially spotted jump up and over the brush, then followed suit. My partner said it stopped grinning and, almost like it was having a chuckle with itself, honestly, he looked like an asshole, turned to the right and jumped up and over the guardrail with the rest of his pack. As we drove away, I rolled my window down, and we did hear a very loud, almost like a chirping or a yapping. It was more like the sounds hyenas make. When I did that, Ron said, "Roll that back up, what the hell is the matter with you?" As we sped away, it was over. The whole event couldn't have lasted more than a minute and a half from when we first spotted him 100 feet down the dark road. Knowing my partner's side of the story now, after all these years, is what bothers me the most. Which is what probably bothered him for so long, is where did the other 3 come from? And what was their plan? What if I was someone alone in a Prius or a Mini Cooper? They'd destroy us. Were they out on a prowl? Or just looking to ambush motorists? Screw with people? I don't know. They were so intelligent to move into the blind spot and had a distraction in front of us like a classic ambush. After having thought I settled my nerves over all these years ago, I now have so many more questions, and I'm afraid I'll never have the answers. That's what my partner swears happened the night he saw a wolf beast on Pumpkin Hill Road in sleepy little Ashford, Connecticut, in our ambulance.
My friend, 26, works in the ER as a general nurse in a major city. The hospital she works at has a major trauma center, possibly the best in the state, so, she comes across some bad shit. Here are the stories she listed. Number 1. She was just walking in and saw a Hispanic family freaking out and yelling in Spanish. My friend knew Spanish and was able to get that they were screaming about a drug cartel coming after them and killing their young son for revenge after he left the cartel. Their 17-year-old son was in the drug cartel and decided to leave. His family urged him to report it, and when he did, they sent a hit out on him. They captured him, cut off his ears, nose, penis, ripped off his fingers and toenails, severed the main tendons in the body, Achilles, the one on the back of the knee, the one in the elbows, some in the wrist, etc. And then, using a dull machete, they hacked at his throat. His spine was visible, jugular vein, corduroid artery, and trachea obviously severed. The family was screaming for the doctors to save him, although it was obviously too late to save him. They never caught the cartel that did that to the young man. Number 2. My friend was working in a small-town hospital ER when she was fresh out of school. Being the end of the school year, there were obviously a bunch of teenagers drinking, driving, doing drugs, etc. This was the only hospital within a 30-mile radius. A pickup truck with 8 teenagers had crashed into a tree. There were 2 teens in the front, 2 in the back of the truck, and 4 in the bed of the truck. The EMTs rushed them in, 1 dead on arrival, 2 in critical condition, and 5 with moderate injuries. The driver had both his legs broken and was losing a lot of blood. The person in the passenger seat had dislocated her left knee. In the back of the truck, one of them had smashed into the metal pole of the headrest of the passenger seat, breaking their nose and jaw. The other one in the back had been thrown in between the front seats and cracked the top of his head on the radio station area. Of the 4 in the back, One was thrown from the truck and hit their head on a rock, caving their head in and dying pretty much instantly. Another one falling out and breaking their spine. Another one smashing into the back window, breaking their arm. And the last one was thrown out of the truck and dislocated their hip. Number 3. Her working at a small-town hospital near a popular hiking trail and park with a canyon and waterfalls, they get a lot of calls for things related to this. One call that upset her greatly was a family of whose kayak had capsized. In the kayak, there was a mom, dad, their teenage daughter, and their 2 twin sons, about 5. The parents and teenager make it out all right, but the 2 sons don't. One is stuck in the kayak and drowns. The other one gets thrown over a waterfall and hits his head on a tree log. The boy arrived in critical condition, twitching, blood seeping from his nose and ears. He was rushed into emergency surgery and managed to survive, but has permanent, severe mental disabilities. Number 4. This is the last story my friend told me that really stuck out to me. There had been a bear attack on a young man. The bear had slashed at the man until being shot by a park ranger. The man showed up in critical, though stable condition. His face had been slashed, skin almost peeled away, but he was conscious and alert, and his airway was open. The man's arm he tried to punch the bear with had been bitten. Blood was everywhere from severed veins and arteries, even though a tourniquet was put on it. The man managed to make a full recovery, and his arm was able to be saved, although he has some difficulties using it because of the nerve damage.
When I was a neophyte EMT, we were called to the scene of a diabetic in a coma. Wife said he fell and hit his head. He was laid out on the floor of their bedroom. While the medics started assessing him and finding no pulse, I was setting up the defibrillator. I was told to stabilize his head and neck in case he had damaged it in his fall. As soon as I had my hands in the correct position, I could tell it was no use. My fingers were in his brain. I told the medic he could stop, as he was getting ready to shock. He said no, we could shock him, and I said, "No, Fred, he's dead. My fingers are in his head." It turned out that he had actually shot himself swallowing his pistol. His wife had cleaned it up, put the gun away, and then called it in as a fall. It's one scene I will never forget.
Paramedic here. My first ever cardiac arrest was when I was a student. I was 19 years old at the time. We get called for a 60-something male short of breath. He's upstairs in his bed having a particularly bad flare-up of his congestive heart failure. We get our stair chair, a chair device they sit in, and we carry them down the stairs, and attempt to get him from his bed onto the chair. He collapses and has a syncopal episode and comes to a few seconds later. We attempt to sit him up so we can lift him onto the chair, and he starts exclaiming,
"Don't sit me up. I can't sit up."
I say, "We have to get you on this chair. We need to get you down the stairs to get you onto the stretcher." He continues to tell us not to sit him up 2 more times when I ask him, "Why can't you sit up?" He says,
"I'll show you."
And then he fucking died. I shit you not. His last words at the time were, "I'll show you." We ended up shocking him, getting him back, got him downstairs where he died again, shocked him, got him back. We did this 4 or 5 times before getting him into the resuscitation room in the ER. Every time we shocked him, he would be back almost talking with us, but obviously still out of it since, he just died and all. I never got the chance to ask him how he knew or what he saw, since it was a crazy dynamic call, but I'll never forget him looking directly into my eyes and saying,
"I'll show you."
He ended up walking out of the hospital 5 weeks later. It was so wacky. I've seen hundreds of deaths since then, and the ones we call Code 5, meaning obviously dead, are always awful. I have lots of stories.
I've been on multiple suicides by train. I work in the suburbs of Chicago, and it's a very popular option. Mostly it's just walking the tracks, making sure you find as many body parts as possible before the public gets their phones out. I don't necessarily agree with suicide, but you have to have huge balls to jump in front of a train going at 50. I swear to God, while writing this, we were dispatched on a psychiatric call where cops had to talk a lady off the tracks with a train coming, talking to her and who is now safe at the hospital.
I asked my dad this. He was in organ donation for many years. This is one of his favorite stories. His job was basically to be ready to go 24/7 to any hospital in his area of the state, Alabama. When an acceptable donor came up, he would go to the hospital, evaluate the patient, and secure consent from the family to retrieve the organs. Next came the actual operation where the various parts to be donated were harvested. I hate using the word harvest, but it's what he uses. They don't always just take things like kidneys or lungs. Often they take other tissues like tendons, skin, and bones. As far as organ donors go, a person who is brain dead from a head injury is the best because the body is perfectly intact, including all of the bones. Dad tells about how they used to remove every major bone except the hands, feet, tibia, fibula, radius, and ulna. So elbow to hand and knee to foot were still intact, but everything else has no structure. He said they would remove the spine last, and after that, the body was just a bag of skin. They would do a baseball-style stitch to hold the skin together and then just fold the person up like a cheap suit and put them in a box to be shipped away to where the family wanted them. He also told about how once he went into a morgue to talk to the mortician and there was a burn victim on the table. He said the body was so burned that the abdomen had busted open and all of the guts had cooked. The arms, legs, and head had burned away, and the torso was so shriveled on the back that the torso was arched up off the table. That poor person.
I've been a career paramedic, but this happened when I only had been one for about 5 years. This has never left me to this day, and I kid you not, it happened just like this. I was driving home on a rural highway one rainy afternoon. It was really pouring, and traffic had slowed to 50 miles an hour. I was following 2 vehicles, and we rounded a bend in the road as a small sports car on the opposite side crossed the center line and hit the small SUV that was leading the 3 of us vehicles on my side of the road. I immediately pulled over and called 911. It was a bad one. I got out to check on everybody. There was wailing coming from the SUV on the side of the road. That's always a good thing because people are breathing. So I went down to the field past the ditch to check on the sports car. There were 2 young guys in the car. The force of the impact had driven the engine to where the front passenger seat should be. The passenger was still buckled, his crumpled hands grabbing the "oh shit" handle overhead. The entire section of car shoveled into the backseat area. The back of the car had peeled away, as had the passenger's top of his head. His jawbone jutted out, raw and jagged. He was clearly deceased, but I felt for his pulse anyway, all while listening to the gasping, ragged, dragging breaths of the driver. No pulse on the passenger. I tried to figure out how to deal with the driver, but there was nothing I could do. The car had literally wrapped around him, and it would be taking an extrication team to get him out. Listening to his dying breathing, I apologized out loud that I couldn't do more. Told him I was sorry to leave him, but others needed my help too. In my heart, I knew he'd never make it, so I went to render aid where it was needed. In triage, we call this black tagging, a patient who wasn't going to survive. I did what I could for the family in the SUV. Emergency medical people and fire services got to the scene and took over. The entire family had injuries, but all survived. The mother had permanent brain damage and lost an eye. But the whole day, those 2 guys in the red sports car stayed in my mind. That night I was home alone and getting ready for bed with just the bedside lamp on, and I heard something in the hallway. It got louder as it came closer down the dark hallway towards my open door. It was like a thump and a drag, over and over. I absolutely froze. A broken hand curled around the frame of my doorway, and then the kid from the passenger seat was standing there, busted up, like he was in the car. I'm totally serious. He looked at me, and I can't recall the exact words of what he said, but it was something along the lines of, "Hey, my friend wants you to know he understands. He wants you to know he's okay. We both are. Thanks for trying." He stood there for a few more seconds just looking at me, and then he stepped back into the shadows, let go of the doorframe, and I listened to him drag back down the hallway into nothing. I turned on every light I could, slept with the lights on for 2 weeks, and I clipped out their death notices from the paper later that week. Turns out they were both high school seniors on their way home from a wrestling tournament. Their car hydroplaned, from what the investigation determined. I'd never have recognized the blonde-headed kid had he not come to me as his unhealthy, unwrecked self. Freaked me the hell out that he came to me busted up. I still have the newspaper clippings, and I'll never forget them, nor their ghostly visit. That's my experience. I've seen a lot of stuff in my 29-year career, but nothing quite that visceral before or since.
When I was working at a trauma center, I saw all sorts of unexplainable things, but this is one of the ones that sticks out most to me. A lady came in, passed out drunk and unresponsive, a typical case. We got her into a bed, did vitals, all the usual things that we could do until she could wake up and answer questions. Part of the intake vitals for an alcohol case was to do an EKG to rule out any signs that the behavior could be heart-related. It was just her and I in the room, with the door open, and suddenly she sits straight up, looks into my soul, and says very clearly, "You're thinking about quitting." I was, because I was unhappy in my job and was thinking about leaving the medical field. I told her so because why not, and she says, "You can't quit. People need people like you. I need people like you. You understand things." And then she immediately fell back on the bed, back to her original state. She did not become responsive until several hours later, which she didn't even remember coming to the hospital. Maybe not necessarily paranormal, but I still look back at that moment and can't help but feel a spark of something that was more than normal. Divine, perhaps? I don't know. I always refer to her as the drunken psychic when I tell the story.
I used to work as an EMT, and I have seen plenty of stuff in my day. Here are a handful of stories that shook me to my core. The first one is probably one that I try not to dwell on often. This happened around 20 years ago. It was a dark and rainy night, and I was just chatting to a friend of mine. We get a call to a nearby hit and run. We sped out fairly quickly and made our way to the scene. A guy had been hit by a car. To us, it was just your standard procedure. We checked for a pulse, saw if he was still alive, and the guy was barely breathing. So, we get him up on a stretcher and into our vehicle. We rush him to the hospital, trying to check as much as we can before we arrive and stabilize him in his condition. He had cuts up and down his body, and his leg was particularly bad. I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to save that one. As we arrive to the hospital, we're greeted by other emergency staff and hand over the patient. He really is in a bad shape. He's losing a lot of blood, and they look down at his leg, and we know we're going to have to amputate. That's where I left it. A few years later is where the story gets particularly gnarly. We get a similar call for a hit and run. We go out to investigate, and it's the same guy. His leg, as it turns out, did have to end up being amputated. He lost that the last time, and this time we look down, and again, his leg is completely mangled. Oh boy, I think. This guy isn't gonna have any legs left. We put him into the ambulance and cart him away. Same hospital, same doctor. He looks down, looks up at us and goes, "Déjà vu?" It was a very weird and odd sensation. I actually followed this one up and was told that the guy lost his other leg. Very weird experience to happen. And after asking about, some of the nurses had managed to ascertain a little bit of information about him. Turns out he was a local drunk. He always used to go to a nearby bar and used to come home by crossing the highway. So it was entirely his own doing. After his first leg got amputated, fortunately just below the knee, he had enough left to get an artificial leg made and managed to trudge himself over the highway. However, this time he was not as successful on his nighttime endeavor and lost his other leg, all for taking a shortcut. If this story taught me anything, is that shortcuts that put your life in danger are never worthwhile. Of course, I've had your fair share of terrible calls too. It was your standard plea for an ambulance, and they weren't sure what exactly was going on. They were hearing noises in the other house, and they sent us and the cops over in case it was something serious. Turns out it was. A little girl had barricaded herself in her room. The stepfather had been beating her. The mother had just let it happen. This wasn't going to end well. The stepfather had been drinking and was battering on the door with a hammer. And if the police hadn't arrived when they did, I shudder to think what would have happened to this child. She couldn't have been any more than 8, cowering in a corner in her filthy, dark and dank room. Human feces was on the corner and some of the walls. It had been very clear to us that this girl had been long time neglected and forgotten and abused. It was very sad to see her like this. We went in, extracted the child, checked her, and apart from bruises and cuts, she seemed relatively fine. She was, however, extremely malnourished. Her face was gaunt. Her skin was a ghostly grey pale colour. And her eyes, they looked like the eyes of a 50-year-old. The stuff that she had seen, that she had had to endure, it wasn't right. Both the mother and the boyfriend got long time in prison for neglect and abuse. I don't know about the girl, as you can't keep track of her while in the system. All that I know is that I hope she is okay, and she's in a better place. Her name hasn't come up since, and I haven't seen her, so I hope she's doing okay. The last story is a call from when I had just started this job. We were dispatched to an old woman's house. It was told to us that all she requested was an ambulance and hung up the phone, so we weren't entirely sure what to expect. We pull up with no degree of haste and start looking around for where the emergency might be. After knocking on the door and getting no reply, we look around the house and the garden. There doesn't seem to be anyone here. We knock again, and that's when the door opens by itself with a creak. We let ourselves in, declaring ourselves and asking if there's an emergency. There's no reply. We're not supposed to go into a house like this without the police, so we step back because we shouldn't go investigate and call the cops in case it's dangerous. Within a few minutes they make their way here and lead the investigation in the house, letting the occupants know that they're coming in to search for the emergency and to please lower any weapons they have. They go in and find no one. So we go into the house and start searching. There really is no one here. They let us know that the call had indeed been received from that exact residence. Whether it be a prank or a ghost, we will never know.
Back in my hometown, I had a friend that worked as an EMT and was one of the first on the scene of a pretty brutal car accident. We had a long two-way road surrounded by a chain-link fence on both sides for a good few miles. A car full of 5 teens, 2 in front, 3 in the back, had crashed into it. It was late and they were drunk and coming back from a party. Apparently they had been flying down that road at maybe 80+ miles per hour when the driver swerved into the fence. The fence was chain-linked and had metal posts, both vertical and horizontal, running along the top. When a car runs into a fence like that and continues to drive through it, knocking the vertical posts one by one, the horizontal ones fall. He said the car went through maybe 40 feet of chain-link fence. There were more than a dozen metal pipes that went through the windshield and through all of the passengers. The car looked like a pincushion. Whenever they had to cut through the pipes to remove the bodies, they were full of tissue, blood, and brains. Black-Eyed Blonde here. I narrate true and fictional scary stories. I'd love for you to let me in, because you can see so much better with eyes as black as mine. So, come get creepy on my channel. The link is in the description and on the screen.